I am very excited to be talking to Luke Berg today. I saw Luke in an interview about a case that he's taking on in Madison involving, I believe it's 14 parents who are suing the school district.
Mhm.
And I wanted to just jump right into that, if you wouldn't mind telling us about that litigation.
Yeah, so the Madison School District, where I live, so Madison, Wisconsin, has a policy that they passed a couple of years ago that allows students of any age to transition to a different gender identity at school, to change their name and adopts new pronouns at school, but without any parental notice or consent. And then the policy actually prohibits staff from even notifying parents about this. And then worse yet, requires staff to actively deceive parents. The policy says, staff should use one name at school and another when the parents show up so that the parents don't find out what's happening at school. So yeah, it's a pretty egregious policy in my view. So we filed a lawsuit on behalf of 14 parents challenging the policy. The argument is that this violates parents' constitutional right to direct the upbringing of their children by excluding them from this important decision. So we filed it back in February, immediately filed a couple motions, and I can give you the sort of current status of the case, but that's sort of the high level overview.
And you said any age, so we're talking 5-year-old to 18-year-old. A child can come in, tell their teacher that they've decided to be the opposite sex, and the school will enable that and actively undermine the parental authority with regard to that.
Yes, there's no age limit whatsoever in the policy, which is pretty stunning.
And how did you find these parents? Because as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking this is shocking. Was the policy public? Did parents find out about it, or was that too hidden from the parents?
Well, so most policies are passed by the school board. So there's a process that the school board has to go through. It has to vote on it, and there's usually a hearing, and parents can show up and comment. This didn't go through those normal procedures. So the school district developed this internally and then posted it to their website a couple years ago with a lot of fanfare. And it's a 35-page document. So I don't how many parents read the whole thing. It's got policy, everything, bathrooms and all the issues. But sort of buried in there is this policy that students can transition without their parents knowing about it. So I think a lot of parents just weren't aware that it was happening. And then the school district started training all of its staff on it. And, as you can imagine, some staff were pretty troubled by this. And I heard about it from a friend and thought immediately, wow, that's scary. Somebody should do something about this. And then I thought, I can. So we actually ended up writing a letter about the policy and what was happening and circulated it. And I live in Madison. And that's how we found the parents to join the lawsuit and challenge the policy.
And this is the second case I've heard of just in this week where a school district has not followed procedures regarding transgender policies and passed things without sort of going through the normal process. And in the other case, a child was hurt. And I'm guessing in your case, because the teachers are hiding all this, how do you as a litigator get access to find out how many children have been affected by this?
Well, you can ask for that information from the district. We haven't gotten to that stage yet in the litigation, but in our view, it doesn't matter that much how many students this has happened to or not. The point is, this is an issue that could come up for any child, and parents have no way to know in advance when or if it will be an issue for their kids. And so they want to know that they're going to be involved and looped in and not excluded if this comes up for their children.
Well, and it's interesting because I can't think of any other issue where teachers would feel emboldened to usurp a parental role and feel like it was okay to hide something so important from a parent. Can you think of, is there precedent for this?
Right. Really, really good point. I've been, working on this case now for a year and thinking about it, and I have not been able to come up with a single example where a school district does this. In fact, the norm is the opposite, right? You need parental permission forms to play on a sports team, to go to prom, to go on field trips, to take medications. We give a bunch of examples in our briefs, but I haven't been able to come up with one example where a school district does this, and the district hasn't given an example yet either. So I just think it's very outside the norm of what schools normally do.
So are you actually suing the school district to change the policy, or what exactly is the lawsuit?
Yeah, so we're not asking for damages or anything. We're just asking for a court order declaring that the policy is unconstitutional, its parents' rights, and an injunction, which is basically a command from the court that if a child deals with this issue and wants to transition, the district has to include the parents, has to notify the parents and receive their consent before it can do this.
Which
So,
just seems unbelievably reasonable. I mean,
yes, right. And that's, we're getting accused of all sorts of things, being transphobic and bigoted and hateful. And, this is not about even whether it's right for an individual child to transition or not. Many parents would be okay with that and others would not. But the point is, parents need to be involved, particularly because the answer may depend on the individual child, right? And circumstances. And,
well, and the other thing that I think about when you're talking is that schools are social. And so are teachers instructing other school children in a classroom with kids who are doing this not to tell? I mean, is this creating like this whole level of deception between parents and their children and other children? I mean, it just seems kind of disturbing. That whole like grooming is what predators do, and they tell children not to tell their parents and they'll keep stuff from them. And so can you kind of speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, right. I mean, this creates dual lives, right? A child is leading a totally different life at school, separate from their family, and that I think is psychologically unhealthy in itself. In terms of practically how the school accomplishes this, I don't know. There's sort of one thing I will note that's interesting. So state and federal law give parents access to all of their children's education records. There's a few minor exceptions, but the general rule is parents have access to all records. And so, that was one of my first questions was, how does the district operationalize this without writing this down somewhere? And so we got a hold of, through an open records request, this form that the school distributes to all its teachers and was part of the training they conducted. And the form is called the Gender Support Plan. So it's, how are we going to go about doing this transition? And at the very bottom of the form, there's this little disclaimer that says, please put this form in your confidential, it's not in student records. So there's an exception in the record keeping laws for teachers' notes. So teachers can take personal notes about the students in their class, just to sort of help them, teach the students and keep track of, things they've observed. But that exception is very narrow. The law specifically says it's only if no other staff have access to that record and it's meant for personal notes. And yet this is a form that is supposed to record how the student will be referred to and how all staff in the entire district will refer to the students. So it's clearly not a teacher's person. And yet the district has instructed its staff to basically violate those laws to keep this from parents. Now, I think if this happens at school, eventually the parents are going to find out, maybe because another student or, a parent or somebody, somehow it gets back to them, but it could be a while. And I think there is a concern, especially in the medical community, that transitioning can become self-reinforcing and actually long-term effects because of that. So that's part of our concern.
Well, it's also really concerning when you have authorities basically supporting a delusion that you can be the opposite sex, which is what the trans ideology has sort of morphed into recently, is that it's not just that you identify, but you are the opposite sex. And so now it's sort of, you have teachers who are supposed to be educating children who are basically promulgating a lie. And I'm trying to imagine sort of the long-term effects of something like that.
Yeah, that's part of what really concerned me in this case. As a parent, our oldest son goes to the Madison School District. And another part of the policy, a part we didn't challenge, talks about how the district will, I think the quote is, strive to disrupt the gender binary. It gives a bunch of examples about how it's going to do that. And it has this long list of books and lessons and things that it's going to teach children. And so we we gave a few examples in our brief, but the examples that I've become aware of do not make one optimistic that they will wait till, middle school or high school. They're starting from kindergarten on. I don't know if there's a headline, I don't know if you saw it, but there was a teacher in an elementary school who transitioned and recorded a transition video and read a book, and they played it to the whole school, kindergarten through 5th grade, with no warning to parents. And the book has quotes like, people recognize that one gets to choose their gender, and things like that. Another example is a parent's kindergartner came home with a coloring book, a Black Lives Matter coloring book with a page that says something similar. Everyone gets to choose their gender, a girl, neither, both, something else. So they're teaching kids this from kindergarten on. And that's what makes it scary to me, is that they do these two things simultaneously. They're teaching young, impressionable kids that they have a right to choose their gender. And then if any child believes them, or even tentatively believes them and thinks, maybe this is me, maybe I should transition, all of a sudden they're going to have a conversation with the district in secret from parents. They might be encouraged to transition by a district staff, and then do it all in secret from parents without any opportunity for parents to weigh in, to push back, to get a professional involved. So that's really scary to me.
Yeah, it's incredibly scary. And the thing that I keep thinking is that they're also going to ultimately undermine themselves, because they are giving little children power that little children are not capable of handling. So they're investing these children with power to dictate their, how they're going to be treated, what name they're going to be used, where they're going to use the bathroom, what locker rooms they're going to use. And ultimately, this is going to really undermine the teacher's authority, as well as the parents and any other authority figure in that child's life.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're one of their justifications of the policies, we're just deferring to students' decision about this, but we don't defer to young children on any decision of this magnitude, right? And fortunately, there's a long line of cases recognizing that. So that's what we're relying on, that, and parents have authority over minor children, is that they're not equipped to make these major decisions. They, just aren't. So.
And I think if it were just a matter of, these kids want to wear different clothes, it still would be pretty shocking. But the fact that we know that, like you said, affirming a child sets them on a path, which ultimately can lead to sterilization, chemical castration, as people call it, having body parts amputated. It's not a benign intervention. It has the potential to result in these kids really being harmed in the long term. And it's so confusing to me how you have schools now that are embracing the idea of breaking gender binary. I mean, what happens when these kids, grow up and they realize that the adult figures in their lives were lying to them about that? How do they make sense of, what else? I mean, my first thought is, what else did they lie to me about,
Right.
So
yeah, we partnered in the case with ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom, for an expert. So Dr. Stephen Levine filed a lengthy expert affidavit in the case, and he really goes in depth about the long-term effects of this, and how there's a lot of people in the field who believe that transitioning can become self-reinforcing, and if that happens, here's the path that you're being set on, and here's all the potential harms for that. So it's a really well done affidavit, and I encourage you to read it if you have it.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, didn't Dr. Levine actually start a gender clinic at one point? So he's not transphobic. He's not, you hear all these things about these, bigoted, hateful people. My understanding is, I think it was maybe Case Western. He started a gender clinic there. So he's really involved in this, and he is somebody who is genuinely sympathetic to people who have gender dysphoria, and not opposed to them transitioning as adults.
Yeah, he's very well recognized in the field, has over 4 decades of experience helping people with gender dysphoria. He was actually the court-appointed expert in one of the largest cases on sex reassignment surgery in the First Circuit. So he's very, very renowned.
So I have, parents sometimes reach out to me because of the coalition that I have. And I'm hearing more and more parents say, I just found out that my daughter's been using the boys' locker room, or I just found out that my son's been wearing a dress at school. And I know that you can't give legal advice, but can you kind of give some insights on how a parent can handle something like that? What kind of recourse they have?
I mean, one thing you can do, the first thing is obviously talk to the school officials and explain your concerns and explain the issues and tell them that, you know, you want to be notified and want to be included in any sort of like that. And then, you know, I would check the policies carefully, you know, like our case shows. Sometimes these policies get passed without a lot of notice or fanfare. And so there may be actually policies on the books that um, allow these sorts of decisions to happen at school in secret. It's not, you know, the Madison School District is not just doing this on its own. They worked with a lot of big groups to develop their policy and got recommendations. There's this group called GLN, Gay and Lesbian Education Network, something like that. But anyway, they've put together a model policy that they've been promoting for a few years, and it includes this aspect to it, that kids should have a right to transition at school, to make these decisions without parental involvement. So, you know, I haven't done a survey nationwide, but I've heard from a lot of people since we filed the lawsuit that Madison is alone in this. So yeah, so parents should absolutely pay attention to their policies, and there might be a opportunity to challenge it, as we've done.
Yeah, it sounds like from what I hear from you and others that parents just need to be really involved. They need to look at the policies. They need to be in the classrooms and a presence at the school so that teachers are aware that they're there, because otherwise, who knows where this will end up leading. So can you talk about where your case is now?
Yeah, so we filed the case anonymously. So every one of the plaintiffs is listed as John or Jane Doe with a number, similar to Roe v. Wade would be the sort of most famous example, but there's actually a lot of cases around the country allowing plaintiffs to do that, especially in this category of cases. So where parents challenge controversial school policies, there's a whole line of cases where parents challenge religious practices in schools. So prayer in schools, Bible reading in schools, having graduations at a church. And courts have pretty uniformly held that parents who challenge those can bring those claims anonymously. So we filed a motion anonymously immediately, along with a motion for a preliminary injunction, which is in order from a court while the case is pending. Or if children begin to deal with this while the case is pending, the parents should be notified because harm can be done. So we filed those two motions immediately. The district fought us on both, naturally, and the court decided to postpone the injunction motion and resolve the anonymity issue first. So we had a big fight about the anonymity issue, and the court said, I agree with you that there's a serious risk that your plaintiffs will be retaliated against if their names become known, but I'm still going to require you to names to, not to the public, but to the other side. But at the same time that the court did that, he also granted a motion to intervene by the ACLU and a law firm representing some student groups. So we ended up having a fight about the terms of a protective order, and it was just not protective enough. And so we have appealed the anonymity issue. So we're currently appealing the court's order on that issue, and simultaneously still moving ahead in the trial court on the injunction motion. So two things are happening at once. We filed our sort of last brief on the injunction just last week, actually. And so now we're for the court to rule. The court might just rule on the papers, or it might schedule a hearing. If he schedules a hearing, it'll probably be September. And then on the anonymity thing, our opening brief is due at the end of August, and then they'll have a brief, and then we'll have a reply brief, and then we'll wait for a decision. So, you know, these cases can take a lot longer than you hope they would, but anyway, that's where we are.
and in the meantime, who knows what's happening at the schools, and that's just it's really discouraging to me that the judge um, didn't allow these parents, to go forward anonymously. And it's also, you mentioned the ACLU, and it's confounding to me how the ACLU has decided to come down on this issue, that they are not defending parental rights, which is what I would have guessed they would do 20 years ago. Now they're defending the school district against parents, which is I just feel like the world's sort of been turned upside down. I don't understand. And you've worked on other cases. I think you worked on another case involving some of these issues. Can you talk a little bit about those?
A little bit. So before I worked for the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, where I work now, I worked for the Wisconsin Department of Justice, and so defense side. When the state gets sued, and there was a number of cases challenging. So there was a prison case, a prisoner who wanted sex reassignment surgery and claimed that it was a violation of the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, if the state did not pay for and provide reassignment surgery. So I worked on that case, and then there was 2 challenges to the state insurance and Medicare, the equivalent of Medicare, state equivalent of Medicare, that had exclusions for sex reassignment surgery. So both of those were challenged.
So a lot of us feel like this is just hitting now, that all of a sudden there are just all these things that are happening that came out of nowhere. But it sounds like, based on your experience, that this has been in the works for a while.
Yeah, there's been a series of cases. I'd say for the 10 years, it's really exploded, the number of cases. But in my research on the sex reassignment surgery cases, I dove into the studies on whether it's effective, and I found just all sorts of stories of people who went through the full surgical procedures and deeply regretted it, and just felt like it did permanent and lasting harm to them. And so that just really sobered me to the damage that this can do, the long-term damage that this can do.
Well, and that's where I'm so thankful that there are law firms like yours, because I'm in touch with people and they're flailing around trying to find lawyers, because right now the ACLU will jump on board to oppose them and to support anything really trans affirming, and the parents really are kind of out there hanging in the wind. And so I'm thankful that your organization and a few others are starting to take up these cases, because I think that the potential is huge. If we start accepting that schools can hide information from parents and can actively try to undermine the relationship between the child and the parent. And it reminds me a lot of therapists who are now taking on a role of reparenting children in therapy without the parents' knowledge. And now it seems like teachers are really taking on the role of parent and actively working to alienate kids from their parents. And in the long term, that's just going to have devastating consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And we really hope that our case will set a precedent on this. It's the first case that I'm aware of challenging a policy, but I doubt it will be the last. And yeah, so I hope it sets a precedent that schools can't do this sort of thing.
Yeah. Well,
when you file a case like this, you look for the case law all over the country, and you try and find the most analogous case that you can. It was interesting to sort of read parents' rights cases and not find many cases that are close to these facts, because, as we just talked about, schools never do this sort of thing. There just aren't examples where schools have tried to, hide from parents a significant issue, mental health issue that's happening with their children at school. Schools just don't do that. The closest case we could find was one out of the Third Circuit. And it was a student who became pregnant, and school staff, rather than contacting the parents, tried to pressure her into taking a pregnancy test and did a number of other things that were totally inappropriate. And the parent challenged, and one of her arguments was, this was an issue that I needed to be looped in, I needed to be involved in to figure out the proper method of resolution. And the court said, yeah, that is, you've alleged a legitimate parents' rights claim, and your rights were violated. So that, we think, is the closest example But, you know, if the more schools start to do this sort of thing, the more cases you're going to have, and eventually you'll have a lot more precedent.
And I was just curious if parents who have kids in schools where a policy like this might be happening, who are concerned about, their children being exposed to potentially, their daughters being exposed to males in the locker rooms or in the bathrooms, even if it's not hidden from parents, is there anything that they can do to challenge that? Because this doesn't just affect the child who's transitioning, it affects the entire school.
I know there have been a number of challenges, I think brought by ADF and maybe some others, challenging the bathroom and locker room policies as a violation of Title IX and other sorts of things. So I know that there are cases on that. Our case doesn't touch on that, but yeah,
okay.
There are other cases. Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you want to share about your case or any other kind of issue related to this before we end?
Yeah, I would just say to parents, pay attention, like we already talked about, pay attention to what's happening in your school. And if you see something that in a policy or hear of something like this, contact somebody like you, contact me, contact ADF. There's a lot of people who can help. So yeah, that's all I would say.
And I just have one final question. If a parent files a Freedom of Information Act and doesn't get any kind of response, where do they go from there?
So most record keeping laws, like that, open records laws, allow the records to sue if they're ignored. So Wisconsin's version sort of requires a prompt and reasonable response, and if they don't, you can file a lawsuit, and usually that's enough to sort of force the government agent to turn over the records. But if not, then the court can order them to do it. So that's one approach that can be taken.
If you have
one of my colleagues.
Oh, go ahead.
One of my colleagues who used to work at Will recently left to start an entire firm dedicated to open records enforcement. So he's a great resource if a parent, at least in Wisconsin, if a parent asks for a record and isn't getting it.
And in regard to the secret record keeping, I guess in that case, if you don't know there's a record being kept and the record's being kept in the teacher's personal files, it's really hard to get access to that.
Yeah, sorry, I think I misunderstood your question.
No, you didn't. It's sort of a follow-up.
Yeah, getting access to your children's records. I don't know that there's any way you could get access to something that the school is intentionally hiding in, a teacher's confidential files illegally, right? I don't know how you would get access to that. They would claim that it's not part of student records. And so the only reason we know that that's happening is because their policy says that that's what they're going to do in this form that we got through an open records request, which is different than getting access to your students, your child's records, indicated that.
Well, and it's interesting. When I was a young mom, my daughter was in a daycare where a child was killed and there was abuse going on. And one of the things that the detectives told the parents was that, you need to take your child to a facility that you can walk into anytime and see what's going on, and that you should do that. And I had always thought a home daycare was more like home. It was going to be more loving. But then I realized that there are limitations because you can't just walk in and see what's going on. And what I ended up doing was getting her in a facility that was very close to where I worked, and I would just drop in regularly. Random times to have lunch or just to chat, and it made me feel better as a parent. And I think that parents need to start doing that with the schools. They need to drop in at lunchtime. They need to drop in during story time. They need to drop in and see what's happening, because otherwise the schools are going to keep pushing these policies and our children are going to end up being hurt.
Yeah, that raises something else I would want to say sort of as a closing remark. Just parents need to be really proactive about this issue, right? I think it's tempting to think as a parent, oh, my kid's not going to deal with this and I'll just wait until they do to talk to them about it. But they're hearing about it frequently from their school maybe, but if not from their school, from their friends, from, their peers, from the internet, whatever. And so I just think parents really need to be aware of what's happening. They need to be aware of this issue. They need to be aware of the damage it can do, and just be intentional and proactive maybe even have conversations about it openly in advance before you think they're dealing with it, or at least be paying attention carefully for signs of it. But it can happen suddenly, especially in the teenage girl population. There's been a number of parents and researchers who've documented this recent trend. I'm sure you're aware of what do they call it? Rapid onset gender dysphoria. It's girls who have no prior indication of dealing with this and suddenly conclude that they're transgender and want to transition.
And often they move forward really quickly. So they go from,
yeah.
I believe I'm a boy, to I want to be on puberty blockers or testosterone within a month or two. And a lot of the gender clinics are willing to enable that. They're no longer having some kind of, I think it used to be kids had to present this way for at least a year. At least a year. Now kids are able to get drugs within, a month or two. And so parents who are thinking that they can just avoid this, it really is. You have to, like you said, be very aware. And it's just one more thing that we need to have on our radar as parents.
Right. Yeah, it feels like more than enough things that we need to pay attention to, but yeah. This is one that, can do a lot of long-term harm. So.
Well, and the precedent of it could be really scary, because one of the things that I'm also seeing is a move towards suggesting that parents shouldn't be allowed to homeschool. And the more that parents' rights are undermined by the school, the more they will be able to push the idea that children shouldn't be allowed to be homeschooled. So,
fortunately, that idea will never survive in the courts. So.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your work and for advocating for these parents. I really appreciate what you're doing. And
thank you too for the videos that you've done. I watched a few of them before this interview, and they were really, really enlightening and helpful. So I really appreciate all the work you're doing too.
Sure. Thanks so much, Luke.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.